January 7th, 2026, 10:47 a.m., Cedar Riverside, Minneapolis. The temperature reads 18 degrees Fahrenheit. Ice coats every sidewalk. And a 37-year-old mother of three lies dead in the street, shot by a federal agent at point-blank range. Within 48 hours, 3,000 federal agents flood the Twin Cities, the largest domestic deployment in Department of Homeland Security history. Within 72 hours, 300-plus protesters clash with armored ICE teams in running street battles. Within 96 hours, President Trump threatens to invoke the Insurrection Act. Hit like so this story reaches more people, because what happened in Minneapolis is only the beginning. Let me show you how a welfare fraud investigation turned into an armed occupation, how a single shooting ignited a resistance movement, and how the streets of America's heartland became a battleground between federal power and civilian defiance. The target was never just one woman. It was an entire community. For months, federal investigators had been building a case against what they called the largest organized fraud network in state history. The Trump administration claimed Somali-owned daycare centers and healthcare clinics in Minneapolis had stolen $9 billion from Medicaid and child care assistance programs. $9 billion. That number dominated headlines across conservative media. It justified everything that followed. On January 5, 2026, ICE announced its deployment. 2,000 agents, 2,000 federal officers flooding into Minneapolis and St. Paul, a metro area with just 600 local police. The stated mission, immigration enforcement tied to fraud investigations. The real mission, send a message. DHS officials called it the largest immigration operation ever. They deployed agents from ICE enforcement and removal operations, Homeland Security investigations, Customs and Border Protection, and DEA. They set up forward operating bases in unmarked hotels. They conducted no-knock raids on homes before dawn. They detained workers at Target stores, restaurants, and public transit stops, and they did it without warning local officials. Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey called it an occupying force. Minnesota Governor Tim Walz demanded federal transparency. The FBI began asking agents nationwide to volunteer for temporary duty in Minneapolis, a tacit admission that the operation was spiraling beyond ICE's control. Drop a comment if you think federal agents overstepped their authority. But the real explosion came 2 days later, January 7th, 2026. 10:47 a.m. ICE agent Jonathan Ekstrand spots a vehicle near 37th Street and Chicago Avenue South, less than 1 mile from where George Floyd was murdered in 2020. The occupants? Renee Macklin Good, 37, and her partner, Carla Guzman. According to federal reports, Guzman was the target, a Venezuelan woman believed to have immigration violations. According to eyewitnesses, Good accelerated toward the agent. According to Ekstrand's own statement, he felt threatened. He drew his service weapon. He fired. 3 shots: chest, forearm, torso. Renee Macklin Good, American citizen, award-winning poet, mother of 3 children, died on the pavement. She had no criminal record. She had no immigration violations. She was an ICE Watch volunteer, a community monitor who filmed federal agents during enforcement actions. She had been tracking them, and now she was dead. Within 2 hours, 911 call logs captured chaos. "There's federal agents everywhere. Someone got shot. They're not identifying themselves. They're just grabbing people. I heard 3 shots. She's not moving." Paramedics arrived within 6 minutes. She was pronounced dead on scene. By nightfall, 200 protesters surrounded the shooting site. By midnight, that number tripled. Federal agents in riot gear formed defensive perimeters. Pepper balls flew. Rocks and frozen water bottles flew back. Minneapolis Police Chief Brian O'Hara issued an unprecedented public statement urging residents to call 911 if they saw ICE conducting operations, effectively telling citizens to report federal agents to local police. The White House condemned the police chief. The Justice Department opened an investigation, not into the shooting, but into whether Minnesota officials were obstructing federal law enforcement. And President Trump took to Truth Social. If Minnesota politicians don't obey the law, I will invoke the Insurrection Act and restore order with the United States military. Subscribe now. You need to see how this ends. What they found next turned a tragedy into a siege. Federal agents didn't pull back after Renee Good's death. They doubled down. On January 12th, the administration deployed an additional 1,000 agents, bringing the total federal presence to over 3,000 officers. That's 5 times the size of the Minneapolis police force, 3 times the number of agents deployed during the 1992 Los Angeles riots. The stated justification? Protecting federal personnel. The real motive? Intimidation. ICE teams began conducting home raids at 4 a.m., breaking down doors with battering rams. They detained U.S. citizens who looked suspicious. They arrested peaceful observers filming from public sidewalks. News Nation cameras captured federal agents forcing their way into a private residence on live television. No warrant visible, no explanation given. Protesters began organizing around-the-clock patrols in Cedar Riverside and South Minneapolis. Somali community volunteers formed ICE Watch networks, using encrypted messaging apps to alert residents when federal vehicles entered neighborhoods. They distributed sambusas, hot coffee, and blankets to protesters. They set up legal aid tents. They turned resistance into infrastructure. Like this video if you support accountability for federal agents. And then the viral videos started. January 11th, 2026, a cell phone clip ricochets across TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. An ICE agent in tactical gear sprints toward a crowd of protesters. His boots hit a patch of ice. He goes airborne, lands flat on his back. The crowd erupts in laughter. Within 24 hours, the video has 14 million views. Within 48 hours, it spawns a dozen remixes, ICE agents slipping, sliding, stumbling on frozen Minneapolis streets. One clip shows 2 agents trying to pull an unmarked SUV out of a snowbank, tires spinning uselessly. Another shows a heavily armed tactical team struggling to navigate an icy sidewalk in full riot gear. The imagery was devastating. Federal agents, armed with pepper spray, batons, and assault rifles, rendered comically ineffective by Minnesota weather. Late-night hosts played the clips on repeat. Jimmy Kimmel devoted a segment to ICE versus ICE. But the optics masked a darker reality. On January 14th, another federal shooting. This time, a DHS agent shot a 29-year-old Venezuelan man in the leg after he allegedly assaulted the officer during an arrest attempt. Video from the scene told a different story. The man, later identified as Luis Ramirez, appeared to stumble while handcuffed. An agent kneed him repeatedly in the back. When Ramirez tried to stand, the agent fired. No weapon was recovered from Ramirez. He survived, but the protests intensified. By January 15th, over 300 demonstrators clashed with federal agents near the temporary ICE facility on East Lake Street. Tear gas drifted through residential neighborhoods. Pepper balls struck journalists. A federal judge, Catherine Menendez, issued an emergency restraining order barring ICE and DHS agents from arresting, detaining, or using force against peaceful protesters.
The Trump administration ignored it. On January 16th, Trump held a press conference. Minnesota has become a sanctuary for criminals, fraudsters, and anarchists. If state officials will not restore order, I will. He announced that 1,500 active duty soldiers were on standby for deployment under the Insurrection Act. The last time a president invoked that authority was 1992, when George H.W. Bush deployed troops to Los Angeles during the Rodney King riots. Now Donald Trump was preparing to do it again, in Minneapolis. In 2026, comment below, is this law enforcement or occupation? The deeper agents dug, the more the operation unraveled. Remember that $9 billion fraud figure? It began to collapse under scrutiny. Investigators from the Minnesota Department of Human Services reviewed hundreds of daycare centers flagged by federal agents. Their conclusion? The vast majority were operating exactly as expected. The viral video that sparked the crackdown, filmed by a right-wing content creator who walked into Somali-owned daycares with a hidden camera alleging no children present, was debunked. State inspectors confirmed the facilities had been closed for holidays or operating during off-peak hours. The $9 billion figure? An estimate of potential fraud across all Medicaid programs nationwide, not specific to Minnesota, not specific to Somali communities. The actual fraud cases under investigation in Minnesota totaled approximately $250 million, a tiny fraction of the headline number. And most of those cases predated the Trump administration's deployment. In 2019, the FBI had already prosecuted the Feeding Our Future scandal, a COVID relief fraud scheme involving 47 defendants, many of whom were not Somali. That case recovered $250 million and resulted in convictions, but it had nothing to do with ICE operations in 2026. The daycare freeze? A political maneuver. Trump's administration had suspended federal child care payments to Minnesota, claiming it would stop fraud. Instead, it left 15,000 low-income families, many of them non-Somali, without access to daycare. Parents couldn't work, daycares couldn't pay staff, children were pulled from care, and the fraud investigation stalled because ICE wasn't there to investigate fraud, they were there to make arrests. Between January 5th and January 17th, federal agents detained over 200 individuals in the Twin Cities. Of those, 74 had no criminal record. 32 were U.S. citizens mistakenly detained. 18 were victims of identity theft whose records had been flagged in error. 9 were journalists or legal observers. At least 12 children were separated from parents during raids. At least 6 individuals were hospitalized after confrontations with federal agents. And Renee Macklin Good was dead. Hit subscribe. This is the accountability journalism you won't find on cable news. But the most shocking discovery came from inside the operation itself. On January 17, leaked internal memos from DHS revealed the true scope of the Minneapolis surge. Agents had been instructed to conduct high-visibility enforcement actions in politically sensitive neighborhoods. Translation: make arrests in areas where media would notice. The goal wasn't public safety, it was spectacle. One memo, authored by an ICE field office director, explicitly stated, maximize optics, demonstrate federal authority, prioritize media-dense environments. In other words, this was theater. Federal agents were deployed not to dismantle fraud networks or deport dangerous criminals. They were deployed to send a political message, and they did. But so did Minneapolis. Community organizers turned the city into a testing ground for new resistance tactics. Activists used drones to track ICE vehicles in real time. They created safe corridors where immigrants could move without fear of detention. They distributed Know Your Rights cards in 14 languages. They packed courtrooms during deportation hearings, forcing judges to confront public scrutiny. They live-streamed every arrest, every raid, every confrontation, and the world watched. Francis Lamond called Minneapolis the new epicenter of resistance to Trump. The Intercept documented the Somali-led resistance. Al Jazeera ran a feature on Renee Macklin Good's life, her poetry, her activism, her 3 children. Her wife, Becca Good, released a statement. Renee nurtured kindness. She believed in accountability. She believed in filming the truth, and that's why they killed her. The words hit like a hammer. Within a week, protests erupted in Chicago, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, and New York. Demonstrators carried signs reading, "Say her name, Renee Macklin Good. Abolish ICE. Minneapolis resists." The movement wasn't just about immigration anymore. It was about federal overreach. It was about militarized policing. It was about whether American streets belonged to communities or to armed federal agents with unchecked authority. Drop a like if you believe in the right to film police and federal agents. By January 18th, the situation had reached a breaking point. Federal Judge Catherine Menendez expanded her restraining order, prohibiting ICE agents from arresting peaceful protesters or legal observers, detaining individuals solely for filming law enforcement activity, conducting immigration enforcement within 500 feet of schools, hospitals, or places of worship. The order was unprecedented. For the first time in modern U.S. history, a federal judge had placed explicit limits on ICE's operational authority in a major American city. The Trump administration filed an emergency appeal. The DOJ argued that the order unlawfully restricts federal agents in the execution of their duties. But the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals upheld the injunction, at least temporarily. ICE was forced to scale back. By January 19, the number of federal agents in Minneapolis had dropped to around 1,200. Arrests slowed, raids shifted to less visible locations, but the damage was done. Between January 7th and January 18th, one person killed by federal agents, one person shot and injured, 217 individuals detained, 32 U.S. citizens wrongfully arrested, 300-plus protesters injured by pepper spray, rubber bullets, or physical confrontations, 14 journalists arrested or detained, 6 children hospitalized after witnessing violent raids. The FBI opened investigations into Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey, and Police Chief Brian O'Hara, accusing them of obstructing federal law enforcement. No charges have been filed. The Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension opened an investigation into the shooting of Renee Macklin Good. As of this writing, Agent Jonathan Ekstrand has not been charged. And the Insurrection Act? Trump didn't invoke it. He didn't need to. The threat was enough. If you made it this far, comment "Justice for Renee" below. Here's what they don't want you to understand. This wasn't about fraud. It wasn't about border security. It wasn't even about immigration. It was about power. The power to deploy thousands of armed agents into American cities with no local oversight. The power to conduct raids without warrants. The power to shoot civilians and claim self-defense. The power to freeze federal funding and punish entire communities for the actions of a few. The power to call dissent obstruction and resistance insurrection. Minneapolis became the test case. If federal agents could occupy the Twin Cities, if they could kill an American citizen on camera and face no consequences, they could do it anywhere. Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, your city. But Minneapolis didn't break. The Somali community didn't scatter. The protesters didn't back down. They stood their ground. They filmed everything. They organized. They resisted. And they reminded the country of a simple truth. You don't need permission to hold power accountable. Renee Macklin Good died filming federal agents. She died doing what every American has a constitutional right to do. And her death became a rallying cry. Subscribe to this channel because the fight isn't over. Share this video because mainstream media won't. Comment below because your voice matters. And hit the notification bell because what happened in Minneapolis is happening again. The federal occupation of Minneapolis didn't end on January 18th. It just went underground. ICE still conducts operations in the Twin Cities. Agents still patrol immigrant neighborhoods. Families still live in fear. But now the community is ready. Every raid is filmed. Every arrest is documented. Every violation is reported. Because Minneapolis learned the lesson every American city needs to remember. When the government sends armed agents into your streets, you don't look away. You grab your phone, you hit record, and you make them answer for every single action. This is only the beginning. The fight for accountability, for transparency, for justice continues. And the question is, Will you stand with Minneapolis, or will you let them do this to your city next? Drop a like, subscribe, share this video, and let's make sure Renee Nicole Good's name is never forgotten.